Only the last half of the last class did not broadcast from the last class and today's notes to you by email, and they're pretty complete. So. Yesterday I was focusing lights and I completely spaced out on the rehearsal.
Oh, that's right.
I thought you weren't going to be here today. Oh, okay, I'm glad you're here. And talk also about rehearsal reports. I know all of you have been in rehearsals, so I really appreciate any input you have on how to make the stage manager's life better, easier, etc. during rehearsals. So please chime in at any point. We left off at a place some miscellaneous notes that I wanted to jot down. So, and to ask you questions about. First of all, if you've been in tech rehearsals with me, I've heard this, is about the use of smartphones during rehearsals. I have discovered in the past that using smartphones, particularly during note sessions, is something that should be avoided because the director or the choreographer or whoever is actually taking notes, or if you're texting with somebody. And so it's just easier for everybody to use paper and pencil. In regards to the rest of rehearsal, I think you really have to gauge if the cast seems to be more engaged with their phones than they are with rehearsal, then you really have to make announcements about it. And if that doesn't work, there are quite a few rehearsals, specifically with students, where the stage manager actually collects the telephones before rehearsals start. And this also applies to texts and performances, but we'll talk about more of that later. I'm not sure if I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that I think is a great way to help with this and also to create a welcoming environment as a stage manager is, if you can afford it, to hand out little notebooks and pencils to everybody in the cast beforehand, and possibly tie the announcement about smartphones into that distribution of notebooks. I've noticed that a lot of dancers and choreographers use spiral notebooks, and it seems like they keep notes about everything in kind of a chronological way, which is great. I have a very old-fashioned way of taking notes, but I learned it and started doing it in college, and I've never been able to break the habit, which is I use a legal pad and I take lists and I actually number absolutely every single thing I have to do in my life. And then when the list gets too long, I copy it onto the next page. Somehow that process of having to copy it every 2 or 3 days helps me a lot. So I don't use the notebook chronologically, but I think that's a great way. And I don't think most dancers would take offense if you ask them to take notes that way. I was going to talk about note-taking a little later on, but as long as we're on the subject, might as well continue that now. So it's extremely important when anybody is giving notes, particularly the choreographer, but anybody who's addressing the company, that everybody listens to all of the notes. No matter who they are, if they are not, even if they don't think they're involved with a particular part of the dance, often notes get given and they apply. One person may ask a question and the choreographer may respond, and it may apply to the whole company. So if everybody is not listening to all of the notes, it can be really annoying when somebody then raises their hand and says, what about this? And the question has already been answered. So it's just something, when you're dealing with students as a stage manager, you sometimes have to go around during the note session and say, would you listen please, or take notes, or stop using your phone. I don't think that probably happens as much in professional situations. I've never actually seen that happen in professional situations, but it's really good to have everybody listen to all of the notes all the time. Excuse me, I'm just going to see if this is a class member. Nope. Okay. Now here's something in my miscellaneous notes that I wanted to ask you as dancers. I don't particularly have an answer to this question, and this is particularly applies to choreography. But do you think as dancers there should be a no more changes date established? Is that something that's even enforceable? Is there a way that could be politely communicated to the choreographer? Or is it actually okay just to go right up to the last rehearsal making changes? I mean, that may be the most common situation, so it's no point in addressing it.
As a dancer, I like that rule, but as a choreographer, I understand going to the last rehearsal, the necessity of needing to make changes. That's my experience. I don't know.
I feel similar, and I think also, like when you first asked the question, what showed up for me was that maybe on certain things there could be a no more changes date, but on other things not so much. So if a choreographer wants to have no more changes, if that change would not change the lighting cue, for example.
Well, yeah, we now have rules here for the lighting designers. So that actually would fall into that, about when because the stage manager has to learn how to call the show. The lighting designer can't keep making changes or the show won't be called properly. But yeah, that's something that should be communicated to the choreographer as well. And then more has to do, well, that can have to do with any little thing when it comes to cue calling.
Because if you're doing the same show day in and day out, it has to keep changing in order to keep it fresh. And so the notes that I've often been given and give are like, let's go from this. But as long as it doesn't change the technical aspect of what's happening, then there can still be change within the system that doesn't change.
Yeah. So it sounds like it would be a good conversation for the stage manager and the choreographer to have even before rehearsals start, and see if they can get on board with some of it or part of it.
And what's
I think it's a really good idea. And this also ties into something that I was just going to talk about that is really complicated, and I do not have a solution, but would love to hear it. So, and this is something we deal with here with the thesis concert, so you'll all be exposed to this, some of you in June and some of you a year from June. And it has to do with thesis chairs, but in a regular company it would have to do with an artistic director. And that is, a choreographer has been working with a company of dancers, and they work and they get the piece set. And then either the thesis chair or the artistic director comes in and wants to change it or make suggestions for changing it. So we actually have a new policy starting in June. We have a new policy that the thesis chair has to attend the first, I think that they cannot give notes, major notes after that rehearsal. Because an artistic director or thesis chair can make huge sweeping changes, like what happened last year with Laura's piece. And I think everybody thought the changes were great, but you still have to be able to rehearse so you can dance them properly, and the lighting designer needs to know where the cues are and all of those things. So it's just something to be aware of. I find it incredibly annoying when people come in and do that late into the process, though they always will come at some point starting after tech start. They usually wait till as late as they can.
Did you say that policy was for the first spacing rehearsal?
Well, I think we decided that they have to be there for the first tech rehearsal.
And they're not allowed to can you repeat the policy one more time? So they need to attend the first tech rehearsal. Right,
and give the notes to the choreographer. The thesis chair only gives notes to the choreographer. They should not, and this is hard with an artistic director, but so let's talk about thesis chairs for a second. They really should be giving no notes to dancers or the lighting designer. It all needs to go to the choreographer. The choreographer then agrees to the suggestions or they don't, and then they pass it on to the lighting designer and the dancers. Because that, if they were to give the notes to a lighting designer or a dancer, that puts two people of authority into the mix, and then it just makes it really confusing, like, who am I supposed to be listening to? You guys have any comments or feelings on how to deal with this in the best way?
I think that's a wise move. I've had directors, after a show opens, go to the stage manager and try and change light cues without going through me as the lighting designer. And that's really problematic because it compromises what I was looking at.
It's also, what happened in a school situation, the moment you're in a professional situation, it would be illegal to do that because the lighting designer owns the lighting design. So yeah, go on, John.
And I've also had, there are directors who say that we'll ask the stage manager for their opinion of a scene or a movement phrase or whatever, and sometimes that gives the stage manager a little bit more feeling of what their job is. They think that they are a little more artistically opinionated than maybe they should be, and that creates kind of the same back and forth where, okay, if the director is not in rehearsal and the stage manager is telling me this thing, is it actually coming from the director or is it coming from the stage manager's opinions? So making sure that there's that clearer line of who is giving the opinions when, and the thesis chair should only go to the choreographer is really important.
Yeah. I think in a situation outside of the thesis concert, in a professional situation, the earlier that the stage manager could have this conversation with the artistic director, the least offense would be taken. I mean, don't even apply it to a specific concert or production, but just in general, try to find a time that this could be addressed. And, I think the stage managers all work different ways. So it's probably good to have this conversation with the artistic director of a company anyway. it could be included in that general discussion of how does the stage manager work and how does this company work under the artistic direction of a specific person. So this also applies in terms of the choreographer and the stage manager. It's like the authority of any supervisor should not be diminished. Well, the authority of a supervisor should not be diminished by there being somebody else who's in the supervisory position who could give other information that contradicts what the authority said. That was, I'm sorry, a very convoluted sentence. But one thing that's really important and why this is established, why, okay, this is the stage manager's domain and this is the choreographer's domain, and this is the rehearsal director's domain, which we'll talk about more in a second. It's really important that that a supervisor not feel diminished in front of, in this case, in front of dancers. So you don't want the choreographer to say something and then the stage manager to turn to the choreographer and say, no, that's not the way we work. That's just not the best way to create good lines of communication and to keep from somebody feeling like they're being undermined. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but I think it's another reason why it's really important to try to establish that before rehearsals start, who's in charge of what. And there's going to be overlap. And the main thing is, you know, stage managers are flexible, most choreographers are flexible. If one of them says something that they think is the other's domain, it's going to be fine. It's not going to be a big deal. We were doing a play 3 years ago now where it had been communicated to the stage manager that they were going to be the person choreographing the scene changes. This was in a play. And so when we got to tech rehearsals, and first of all, none of the scene changes had been choreographed prior to techs, which is now something that has also been changed at St. Mary's, that they have to be done before techs start because they can take forever. The stage manager got really pissed off when the director started to choreograph the scene changes because they thought it was their responsibility. And it can be either one. A director may say, yeah, you make the changes. And generally, like with scene changes, if the scene changes are happening during a blackout or between pieces, yes, the stage manager is the person who choreographs those changes. This was a situation where the lights never went down and the action of the play was going on while the sets were being changed. So, you know, it was hard to tell whose area it was going to be. But it was of no clear lines of communication and people pissed off. It was really ugly. And it happened in front of the cast and the crew.
You bring up a really good point, though, that I had not considered, that I think maybe it goes without saying that the changes that happen in the dark are the domain of the stage manager, and the changes that happen in the light are up to the choreographer.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate. I mean, it's such a generalization, but
Right.
Yeah.
I just hadn't considered that before.
Yeah, in the light, I mean, a lot of times we use the expression a vista, which means it's in the light, it's in the view of the audience. So if you hear a choreographer or a director use that expression, a vista, they mean that in the view of the
How do you
audience.
spell that?
I'm not really sure. I just assume that A is one word and vista is another, and A means something in Italian that I don't know. But yeah, it's exactly what you're saying. It's within the view of the audience. Within the... Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about leadership in terms of this particular subject. We're actually going to be spending a whole class on leadership versus management later on, so I'm not going to go into much more detail than that. So from research that I did from other books and from other sources, including something that I don't think I've mentioned, which is a fantastic resource, which is the SM Network. And the SM Network is something that you can either become a member of, and I'm not sure if there are requirements or fees for that. I am not a member, and a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in is open to anybody who goes to that website. But it's a chat room for stage managers. And so people ask questions, and all kinds of stage managers ask questions, and they're incredibly helpful things from other stage managers, professional stage managers from all over the world, and say, well, this is how I deal with the situation. So some of this information comes from that. Some comes from articles written by choreographers and others by stage managers. This is the general topic of dealing with dancers during rehearsal. So this applies to actors as well as dancers, but during rehearsal, dancers may leave the rehearsal area. It's generally good practice that dancers or any performers, or in fact any crew members, that they check in and out with the stage manager or assistant stage manager anytime they leave the rehearsal room. And they can do this by it's not like you have to stop rehearsal. A dancer could just look over at the choreographer, at the stage manager, and acknowledge that they're leaving with hand signals and say, I'll be back in 5 minutes or something like that. But generally, once rehearsals start, it's good practice. When you start tech rehearsals, you absolutely have to check in and out with the stage manager, whether you're a member of the crew or a cast, because there is an assumption that when you sign in at the call board, that means you're in the building and you're not allowed to leave the building or the appropriate rehearsal or performance space until you sign out or until you've checked in with this stage manager. And it's something that happens a lot in student situations, so it's something really to communicate well to students about don't leave the space, and it's not like we're going to keep you here if you don't have to be. But when we're rehearsing in the theater, the stage manager wants to know if a dancer actually even goes into the lobby, any place where they're not in earshot of the stage manager. And you need to think ahead so that all dancers are ready for an upcoming dance or section of a dance. This also applies in theater as well. So you're watching a section of a dance being choreographed, and you're kind of sensing that the choreographer is getting to the end of that section. It's something that you just have to feel and intuit, which is a huge job of the stage manager to figure out where the choreographer is. And if you feel that you're about to move on to the next thing, and hopefully that next thing is on your schedule, you need to notify the people who are in the next section to come into this theater or the rehearsal space to be ready to go on. It's when you start something and then it finishes, and if people are not ready to go on to the next section, it's very annoying, really annoying. And you know better than I how short time is in this situation. So you have to keep your eyes everywhere. Sorry, I'm just going through a list of notes here, so that's why I keep looking to my left here. And this also ties into that. It's when you're working as a stage manager, particularly without an assistant stage manager, you're often sitting at a table with the choreographer next to you. It's important that you are not trapped behind that table. Stage managers often have to pop up and go somewhere, so it's good that you have good access in and out of the table, and if you're the stage manager or there's an ASM who's running to talk to dancers, that they're sitting at the end of the table so they can get in and out. And it's also good so that dancers can actually come over and talk to the stage manager without disturbing the choreographer. So it's kind of how you set up the stage manager, the working table. You just don't want to be trapped, and you don't want to be isolated as a stage manager. You need to be available to everybody, and you need to be able to pop up at any point. So I have a question that I thought of, which I didn't see in anything that I read about, but how do you deal with dancers who don't know their choreography? I mean, I guess it's not knowing their choreography to the point where they really should know it, as opposed to they learned it in the previous rehearsal and they came in and they need a refresher, you know, and that may be okay. I don't know, have you ever run into a situation where the dancers haven't done their homework? Because it happens in...
I do all the time, but it's kids, so I feel like it's totally different.
How
do I deal with it?
Yeah.
It depends on the age and how long they've been dancing. So I usually, I mean, if it's like a more of a beginner or a younger kid, then I just like explain to them how fun it is to be on stage when you know what you're doing and you're confident, versus how terrifying it is when you don't know what you're doing, and that I want them to have a good experience, so they need to go home and practice. And I reiterate all the tools that I've given them to practice, making sure they have their music at home, making sure they have the, you know, videos. We do that a lot with these days. With the older advanced kids that have been dancing for a long time, I get to the point where I'm like, I'm going to take you out of this section if you don't know what you're doing the next time I see you.
Good.
Yeah. But they know better. You know, you have to wait until they know better.
Outside of the school situation, if you're working in a small dance company, do you expect dancers to rehearse outside of rehearsal? Or is it pretty much all done in rehearsal?
I expect them to do whatever they need to do to be ready for the next rehearsal.
Yeah, certainly warmed up and
well, if they
dressed
don't
properly.
Know the choreography, and this ties into your previous question, there's a couple of different ways that I've troubleshooted that. First is, usually in the development of us working together, there will be someone who gets the choreography a lot quicker than everyone else, and I kind of, I show the entire cast like where specific strengths are for people, and so when I see that someone has a real knack for memorizing the choreography, I kind of give them this responsibility of like helping others.
Right.
If we're doing something and there's space between to go work with this person. But I also started casting understudies, and that's a two-part thing. The first is having an understudy puts the pressure gently on the cast to know what they're doing, otherwise they know they're going to be replaced. But also that's someone else who may have been paying attention to what their specific role is. They can work with the dancer outside of that particular rehearsal to go over it with them at another time.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I see that that needs to happen or someone doesn't feel really clear at the end of the rehearsal, I would make an announcement that says, you know, this dance, you have the choreography really well, perhaps you could work with this person who hasn't gotten it yet, or our understudy, if you two will work, you know, 30 minutes longer in the lobby or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Just to go over it.
That's really good, because most people feel flattered if you put them in a position of, not of authority,
right.
but you know, putting them in that
Recognizing
position,
talent.
recognizing
You know,
talent.
there's some people that just have a better brain for that. I used to be one of those people, and now I'm not. And so I look for those people who are going to memorize it. Hey, can you work with me for a few minutes and go over this?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's helpful on both ends of that. It
Mhm.
accentuates the strengths of one and allows them to kind of be in a position of leadership to help someone else.
Yeah, that's great.
Which kind of ties back into the last thing that you were saying about not undermining someone.
Uh-huh.
And what I was getting from that is we're talking about what not to do, but I think the thing to do is to remember that the collaborative spirit or the collaborative mind is the thing that we're all trying to show up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Okay. Just something that all stage managers have to do. If you're aware of noise or disruptions in the rehearsal area, you need to deal with them privately. I have a tendency, I would just like to yell, shut up at the top of my lungs, but that's not the way to do it. You may have to after a while. That's why I'm not a stage manager. But it happens a lot with students. Just one, and I got all this from information that I read online, but there's just a note that in each day, dancers may rehearse for more than one role within more than one dance piece. And so the rehearsals need to be structured and organized to make the best use of the dancer's time and energy. So that's just something to do with planning and scheduling. I know we've already talked about scheduling, and I'm sure you all included this when you were doing your rehearsal schedules, that you know, it has to be organized. You can't put too much strain on people, but you also want to be considerate of the work that other people are doing, and take that into account when you're scheduling and working with people. One thing that's really important for us in both in dance and theater is that the stage manager is the dancer's advocate. Other people on the production team, particularly in my case as production manager, I have very little contact with, whether it be a dance performance or the production of a play, aware of the needs of the performers. And this really falls to the stage manager to advocate for them regarding all kinds of things: rehearsal conditions, comp policy, scheduling, just anything that may be the concern of a performer, because the stage manager is the only person on the entire production team who's aware of what the performers are doing. Not the costume designer, not necessarily even the choreographer. It really falls to the stage manager. So you really need to be their advocate. In professional situations where you have union dancers, you still need to do this, but they also have a union deputy who would be somebody elected by the dancers from their own union, and that address protections that are covered under union. But these tend to be less defined things. It's just being really sensitive to how the performers are feeling. And if that needs to be communicated to the choreographer, or if the production manager is doing the scheduling as opposed to the stage manager doing the scheduling, it all needs to be communicated to them. You know, it can happen about a costume. A dancer may not feel comfortable talking to a costume designer about a costume that's not working for them. A stage manager has to fall into that role of being the advocate. So that's conversation about dancers. So let's turn our attention a little bit to dealing with difficult choreographers. say I don't have a lot of experience in dance because I've worked particularly with 2 dance companies. I haven't worked with a lot of dance companies. I've just worked extensively with 2 companies, and neither of them were run by difficult choreographers. That's very different in the theater, where I've worked a lot and run into lots of very difficult directors. But so dealing with a difficult choreographer, this is something that's really important, and we'll do this more when we do role playing. You cannot change that person's behaviors, whether anybody. That applies to the stage manager too. Though the stage manager should have spent their whole life being calm and trying to have as few strange character behaviors as possible. Somebody with very distinct character behaviors as a stage manager is probably, if they're at all negative, is not going to have a long career as a stage manager. So you need to separate your perceptions of negative personality traits from the behaviors that affect your work or the work of your dancers, because you will have to address these things. And so one of the things is you need to be very specific. So I work with a director here, and I've worked with them for many years, and they're very difficult, and the things that they do in rehearsal, they keep repeating over and over again. But there's no real way to say, you keep doing this, or I hate the way you work with actors. You have to be very specific and identify what that negative behavior is that's affecting the other people in the room. It's one of the most difficult things that stage managers have to do. I mean, this also applies when you're dealing with dancers as well. And a lot of times the negative behaviors come straight from those negative, personality traits, but you have to somehow divide them from each other when you're addressing those people, so that you don't get into a situation of the choreographer disliking you, or never wanting to work with you again, or feeling that you're putting them down in any way. When you're dealing with this stuff, you need to deal with these things outside of rehearsal, never in a public place. It sometimes can happen that you have to stop rehearsal and say, take 5. I mean, you see that in movies all the time when people are on movie sets, and you've got difficult movie stars and they take a break. But you do have to do that. If the situation becomes untenable in a rehearsal situation, you have to take a break and go somewhere with the choreographer or the dancer for that matter, and have a private conversation with them and deal with them calmly and from a positive standpoint to try to work through. And a lot of these things come from somebody's personality behavior, so you may have to do them over and over again. I'm finding myself in a position now of having said something to a director last year that they really didn't want to hear, and it's now kind of coming and being treated. I didn't really know. This was after the fact. This was after, but it had to be dealt with. So, which leads me to the next thing written down here, is person, the choreographer, the dancer, negative personality behaviors or character traits. Once that production is over, once that concert is over, you have to make it, and that's where I ended up. I'm never going to work with this person again because it was just too hard for me. So, yeah. There are lots and lots of people, of artists, who can be very difficult. They put their hearts on exhibit for the world to see. It's in the best way an extremely egotistical profession to be an artist. You're putting your heart and soul out there, and so it can be very difficult. There are lots of difficult people. And some of it, as I think I've told you, is I've stopped even working or even considering taking a job in the world and the environment that has become acceptable in the world of opera, which is directors who feel they can say whatever they want to whoever they want. So,
which used to be the world of dance, but I find that that has really changed.
Yeah, and I mean, you just noticed with the head of both the San Francisco Ballet and New York City Ballet being fired somewhat because of bad sexual behaviors, but also from mistreating people in general, having nothing to do with sexual behaviors. And that's a good thing that that's happened. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, George Balanchine and Jerome Robbins were both terrors. From my understanding, I've never worked with them. And it must have been, I mean, I do have a friend who was a stage manager for Jerome Robbins, and she just hated it. But she had to, once you're in it, you have to deal with it. Once it's over, you don't have to do it again. But yeah, you're right. It's a really good thing that's come out of, I think it's come out of the Me Too movement. So it's not just about sexual behaviors, but about assault. And particularly in the world of ballet, where young people are beaten and berated by people above them, it can be very rough. So, and you know, and there's I think some people in authority who feel like, well, that's the only way that it's going to work. Okay, well, that may be true for them, but we're talking about from a stage management standpoint, so you need to make the best possible situation that you can, and be prepared to be yelled at yourself, but not in rehearsal. So harping on this again is you need to know what your role is as stage manager and plan how things are going to work with the choreographer prior to rehearsals starting. And that's generally prior, you know, people are generally really upbeat and they're excited and they're going to be a lot more positive before rehearsals start, and they run into the problems of rehearsals. So as far in advance as possible, probably the moment you're hired as a stage manager, you want to start talking about, okay, what's going to work for you and what's going to work for me. Just some words of advice, and these apply to dancers, choreographers, rehearsal directors, and stage managers. Transform jealousy into opportunity. Jealousy issues can arise when dancers feel like they're not being used to their full potential. Remind each member how important she is. This is really a tough one in the dance world, because I've just noticed in my limited experience that dancers, I don't know if they're more sensitive than actors. I think part of it has to do with the world that choreographers or artistic directors have set up, that it's okay to be, I don't even know what the right word is, I'm going to say overly sensitive, but it's okay to exhibit certain behaviors because you're a performer. And you have, once again, you have to deal with that on a case-by-case basis and being very positive and very specific. But I think you'll also want to, if you can, kind of change the environment as much as you can so that it's not, you know, it's not a therapy session. That's the main thing that I've noticed with dancers, that sometimes it can be a big therapy situation. And, there's a time and place for that, but not in the rehearsal room.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that just for a second.
Sure.
Because from what I hear you saying is that dancers tend to be more sensitive, and I think that's because movement is our first language,
Mhm.
and verbalization is our second language. And so when we're in the realm of dance as our art form, as the language that we're using, we're in that embodied state, what we hope to be, to where everything that has come before this moment is creating us, and we're bearing our souls.
Mhm.
And so we're accessing the psychological, the physical, the history, the hope for the future presentation of it. And so it can be a very psychophysiological place to be in while in the moment of rehearsing. So I think like the general idea of outside of rehearsal is a better place is a general, yes, that's the right thing to do, because when you're in it, if you've just gone from like being in the piece to working out whatever it is that you're artistically projecting, you have put yourself into that emotional space to be that, and then to give notes or kind of organize it in that moment takes a lot of emotional maturity for that dancer to move out of that role into a different role and then get back into that role to do the other thing. And so I think I heard a little bit of a question when you said, I don't know why this is, and I think that has more to do with it than even less of the ego, but the ego comes in to like protect the character that has now come into this psychophysiological space that is very vulnerable.
Right. And there's one thing, and Jermaine's not here today, so he's probably going to take issue with this, but in the world of ballet dancers tend to be more immature than the regular population because they start working when they're so young, and that's the entire focus. I mean, the way I've noticed is you hear really famous ballerinas in documentaries, and they sound like little children over and over again. And, this is true of the guys too. Those guys that just got kicked out of New York City Ballet, they were like behaving like teenagers. And I really understand why it happens. But I think that makes the dance world vulnerable as well. I think the other thing that I've noticed that happens dancer to dancer, like dancers don't get along with another dancer. So I think as much as possible when casting is announced or before casting is announced, that if you know about things that happen backstage about dancers, that you let the choreographer know and say, are you aware of this? And do you still want to go ahead and cast these people as partners in this dance? As much as you can head that off at the pass, the better. And it's not, I've only witnessed this from the sidelines here at St. Mary's, so I don't know if it's jealousy issues, but because I share my office with 3 choreographers, I get a lot of upset dancers who come in there. So I'm not sure if there are issues with other dancers or jealousy because I don't listen to them. I can just hear somebody crying, but I'm not sure what they're crying about. So it's not just jealousy. So, as much as you can inform the choreographer or director about what's going on with these people, you as the dancer's advocate, you are much more in tune to this than the choreographer is, of what's going on with the dancers in the company. And they're gonna feel more comfortable with you probably than they are with the choreographer.
Well, even the word jealousy stems from the word insecurity. So I think as a stage manager, anything that you can do, like you said, to change the environment, to bring them back into security is going to help them do their job better.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, another word of advice for dance stage managers and all stage managers is leading by example. It's easy to demand respect by nagging or talking down to people, but commanding respect by showing commitment and earning your position is more effective and will create a positive environment. Yeah, the stage manager needs to be pristine, above suspicion, not Brett Kavanaugh. You have to be a really good example. Being stage manager is really hard. There's so many things that you have to do that involve so many different areas of learning. A lot of people in jobs kind of need to know only one thing. The stage manager needs to know a lot about a lot of things. Watch your tone without yelling or raising your voice. Lead rehearsal with authority and positive energy. I've noticed with student stage managers, there tends to be an issue of volume. People tend to think that if they're speaking loudly enough for people to hear them, that they're being mean or being angry. That's not true. And if nobody can hear you, then, it's worthless. Constantly use inclusive pronouns, using words like we and our instead of you guys or my team. And I've been training myself to stop saying you guys in general for obvious gender reasons. So don't say you, don't say you guys ever. Being inclusive instead of, putting yourself in the same boat as the people that you're addressing, because it does apply to you. Anything you're going to ask somebody else to do, you are expecting of yourself. So put yourself in the same boat. Keep everyone informed and accountable. We've talked a lot about keeping everyone informed. Avoid body language blunders. Your body language speaks volumes. Be mindful of it when you're addressing and leading the dancers. Some examples: sit down while they're dancing. So if the dancers are rehearsing a particular scene or moment or section, if you're wandering around the theater, you're projecting disinterest in what's going on the stage. So sit down and watch. You take your water breaks when the dancers take their water breaks. It's just being very self-aware too, because body language, there's huge things about body language. I think I offended a student stage manager last year when I told her that she really needed to get her hair out of her face because she had hair like this and it just wasn't projecting the kind of image that I think she wanted to project. So there are myriad of body language things. I know I project all kinds of things with my mouth. I have thin lips in the first place, but I can get really tight-lipped and my lips can disappear altogether when I get angry with somebody or I'm not telling the truth. So I think we're all aware of our particular things that we have to be aware of in rehearsal. Keep your feedback short and sweet. Yeah, people have shorter and shorter attention spans, as you know. Dealing with know-it-alls. Sometimes dancers will want to correct one another, which can turn into nitpicking sessions. If you become aware of the situation, address the dancer privately and in a positive manner. The dancer may talk to the choreographer about potential changes to choreography or how someone works, but they should never directly direct their notes to a dancer. And this applies to actors too, and it happens a lot. And I think can be addressed at the start of a rehearsal period. if you feel like somebody is not doing something properly, go ahead and tell the choreographer, and then if they think the same thing, then they tell the dancer. But dancers should never give notes to each other. Except, and I've noticed this just from watching documentaries, when people are partnering each other, you really need to talk about how to make things the easiest way to do things as well as the safest way to do things. And I don't think that people in a partnership situation would take umbrage with that. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, because as I said, this is just something I've seen in documentaries. And in that situation, I think it's worth it for dancers to talk to each other.
Yeah, and I think that it ties back into the inclusive language thing that you were talking about. In that instance, like when you said that, I was like, yeah, but there's moments that that's not the case. But so this is one of those moments where instead of we, like if I need to give a dancer, like it's better to bring it to I. Like, I feel like it would be better if you were further up on my back, or I feel like it would be better that we needed
definitely when it has
do this extra turn, and then it takes the responsibility off of the choreographer, off the dancer, and says what you need. So it's like advocating for self.
I think the we behaviors I was talking about had to do with rehearsal behavior, as opposed to choreograph, whatever you want to call it, choreography behavior. That's not really right, but I know what you mean.
When a know-it-all is giving things, they may use the inclusive language of we, where if they're in the habit or knowledge, or maybe you've set this up as far as communication with the choreographer and the dancers and the stage manager ahead of time, that when I'm giving feedback, I'm giving it from my personal experience, then a particular dancer can say everything that they want to about their experience in it without being a know-it-all to everybody else.
Even in that situation, I don't think it's proper to, if you're rehearsing on stage, to address that with a person. Even if you are personalizing it. No, it's dancer to dancer. I would do that more on a break, or, when there's a moment. I mean, there are lots of breaks during rehearsal, particularly for dancers, like in seconds, but yeah. Just so you don't run the risk of somebody feeling put down or anything negative in the face of other people. And one last word is to end rehearsals on a positive note. We already talked about ending rehearsals by announcing what the next scheduled task is that the people in the room are involved with, usually rehearsal. It could be a tech or a photo shoot or costume fitting. But yeah, just in terms of keeping the positive feeling, even after a really wicked rehearsal, try to find something positive to say. So anybody else have experience with anything else that we're talking about? We're talking about deeply personal things. So I'd love to hear from you, from your own experiences about keeping the best possible rehearsal environment.
I had an experience my first quarter at UC Irvine with a grad student that, as a student, what made it the most difficult was she told me not to come to a tech rehearsal. So long story short, she cast me in a piece that was going to be on point, and I didn't audition on point because I have severe tendonitis and I can't keep up because that's just too much for me. So I told her, I wasn't a good fit. She wanted me to do it anyway, but then ended up being really terrible to me in the long run. But I got injured and I was just an understudy by the end of it anyway. And I kept coming to rehearsal, and I came in and she met me at the door and was like, we don't need you here. I just need to focus on who's dancing, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay. So I was like, but don't I need to go to this tech rehearsal? But as an undergrad, I didn't know any better. And so she told me not to go. So I didn't go. And then I got a terrible grade when I had gone to every rehearsal that entire quarter, except for what she told me not to go to because she didn't need me there. And I think that the thing that was confusing the most for me is that as an undergrad, I didn't know like what the rules were, and my choreographer, and like I feel like it could be the same with a job, like although the choreographer was in charge in the long run, she wasn't really in charge of my grade, and the people who were in charge of making sure you were there for specific rehearsals and not being there, I feel like she just kind of got a big head about it and didn't look out for what was best for her students for their and what I needed to do as an undergrad. She led me astray for what I should be doing, and I ended up with a grade that didn't reflect what I had actually put in. So I don't know, that was my experience. Like, I'm sure other people have had much worse, but for me, that was like, for my first show in college, it just really like set me up for, not a good experience. So.
Yeah, because that can happen with the students who are on crew here. Somebody who works in the scene shop, they do their job or they don't. But I'm the person who gives the grade, not the tech director, who's also the scene shop supervisor. There's not a whole lot you can do as a student about this, but it's just being clear. When you're a professor, that you're getting the input from the right person. I ask the tech director what grade the student should get. I don't arbitrarily give the person the grade, but I can see that it does happen in that kind of situation. Just a question, did you say even though you had dropped out of performing in the dance, you were still an understudy?
No, I didn't drop out. I told her that I didn't think I was a good fit right after I got cast, and she said, "Oh, I'll work with you." And I was like, "Okay, are you sure? You don't want to just have somebody else do it." And so she had me and one other person. We ended up being understudies for her piece, which I was fine with because I never felt like I could keep up anyway, on point. And then she just so I had a separate injury, but I went to watch rehearsal anyway, and then she told me not to be there. Basically, even though technically, because I was there, I was required to be there for a grade, but she told me not to be. So my understanding was that she didn't want me there, so not to go. But then I got marked down and got like a C for that. So.
Yeah, the reason I was asking is because generally understudies have to be there for all the rehearsals.
Right, which I did have to be there. She just told me not to be because I don't know. Anyway, she didn't lead me in the right direction.
Right. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about working with a rehearsal director. So this has more to do with bigger ballet companies. So how do stage managers work alongside the rehearsal director and the choreographer within a dance company? And how does their work contribute to the success of a performance? A rehearsal director is generally responsible for coordinating and supervising the rehearsals within a company. They may be known as the choreographer's right-hand man, and it is usually their responsibility to ensure that the dancers know and are able to interpret the work as set by the choreographer. So I think the lines of command are pretty clear there, because stage managers in dance performances generally do not supervise how somebody's doing the dance. If it's not the choreographer, it's not going to be the stage manager. So, but once again, it's just clarifying before rehearsals start who's doing what. In large companies, there may also be, I'm going to mispronounce this word, a repetiteur. And in this instance, the rehearsal director would not necessarily teach a work in the absence of the choreographer, as they are not generally considered to be experts on the work. I'm going to skip over this. I'm just bringing it up as a reminder of defining responsibilities before rehearsals start. In smaller dance companies, it may be that the rehearsal director is also a dancer in the company and that they are able to lead certain rehearsals as well as perform with the company. Be sure you define your role as stage manager before rehearsals begin. I think this can particularly happen in the area of scheduling, that the rehearsal director understands that you as the stage manager are in charge of the schedule with input from the choreographer and from the rehearsal director. Some other words of advice for dancers. These are for dancers, but I felt like they need to be communicated to the dancers by the stage manager, and some of them are very obvious, but everything always needs to be repeated. To be prepared, to nourish yourself, to stay on task. If you're in an alternating cast or understudying, stay on task when your part is being rehearsed by somebody else. Pay close attention to what is going on. Don't be sitting on the floor talking. Very important corrections and possible adaptations might be made. We talked about this in terms of giving notes. Yeah, so you as stage manager may just need to prompt these understudies or other dancers to pay attention when they are in fact not dancing or not being directly addressed by the choreographer.
Is it the stage manager's job to schedule runs with the understudies, or there's no clear rules about how often the understudy gets to actually practice running the whole piece?
In the theater, it definitely is. I'm not really sure in dance, because I don't think a stage manager would be expected to know the choreography as well as how to perform that choreography, the style that comes with it.
I think
maybe schedule.
And scheduling, not because I did a musical with Woodminster, and I was an understudy for 2 characters, and I never had the opportunity to step into the role, but one of the other understudies had to do it one night, and I mean, if that happened to me, I would have been that dancer that didn't know the choreography, because I never got to be in the place. Like, I knew the movements, but it was different depending on who I was playing, and so I was wondering if stage managers do consider that and schedule.
Well, they do, and I can kind of understand at Woodminster, you're probably, I don't know if you're being paid or just being paid,
it's like
car fare or something.
Yeah, but
so they don't want to burden you by having to come to rehearsal.
Well, they are burdening you though if you have to play the role
right.
and you haven't practiced it.
Right.
Yeah, that was the horrifying part of it.
So I was just reading this story about, this is a horrible story about a Broadway dancer who committed suicide because of something that happened in rehearsal that, like in a Broadway contract, and this was for a dancer in a musical, the understudy gets paid the same amount as the person who's performing. So yeah, they need to be there. Yeah. We talked about notes. Being sure as stage manager to remind dancers if they need to video things, to do it. If the stage manager can help out with this, all the better, but dancers cannot assume that the stage manager is going to videotape their own work, but you could help grease the wheels. Do your homework, show your good attitude, plenty of fluids, bring knee pads, have extra layers. So a good place for all of this stuff would be under company rules, something that you would pass out at the first rehearsal, and something that you can write in really clever, easygoing fashion. It's always good to have this stuff written down, because if people say what, then it's like, well, we did refer to it back as the first rehearsal. Like, I'm I'm lucky enough when I give grades to my students, I also have to do an evaluation on them. So I have written descriptions of everything that they've done and how well they've done them. So when they say they don't like the grade they've gotten, all I do is bring out this written document and they go, oh, okay, now I understand. So, and then I just have, well, yeah, I'm going to keep going with this. A lot of this is anecdotal, but I think that's how we learn stage manager to stage manager. In other words, in a lot of cases, you are hired as stage manager, but are actually expected to be stage manager, production manager, TD, carpenter, prop master, sound designer, and or lighting operator, and wardrobe. Well, someone has to wash out the dancers' costumes every night, and they aren't likely to do it themselves. Which brings up something that I would normally not talk about in this class, but it becomes an issue, is about hygiene, and it does happen when people share dressing rooms, and it's just extremely sensitive, and you do everything you can to deal with it indirectly, and sometimes you have to deal with it directly, but it has to be dealt with, certainly in private, but, and hopefully this is more in the school environment, but I don't know, it must, I bet it happens in professional dance companies too, where you're all in it, sharing a, because your work is so physical, and you're a lot of times sharing one room as a dressing room.
It definitely happens with preteens.
Happens to what?
With preteen, like that age group of kids where they go from not needing deodorant to needing deodorant, or like kids that show up with tights that clearly haven't been washed and they've worn them like not just more than once, but several times, and you're just like, what the hell? Anyway, so there's those conversations.
A good thing with the deodorant thing is to buy lots of deodorant and leave it around the dressing room. That doesn't work so well with dirty tights, though. Say this is an anecdote from a choreographer, a stage manager of a medium-sized dance company. Choreographers, and I thought directors could be difficult. Choreographers are a completely different breed. They get to create in the rehearsal process. Things change daily, including the order of when things happen, which means it's almost impossible to keep orderly notes. Then there is the you get asked for X, give them, miraculously provide them with X and Y, and they want to know why you didn't come up with Z as well. That's something that happens to stage managers. Choreographers are also notoriously known for impracticality. One show I worked on, intended to be a touring show, had as its set a grove of trees, real trees. Another choreographer wanted, yesterday of course, one down feather to be rigged to drop on cue in a space that required a personnel lift extended fully to reach the pipe, but didn't have one. We did get one from our lighting designer that allowed me to rig this feather every night. So the one thing that this brings up is when a choreographer asks you to solve the problem, you know, ask the lighting designer, ask the tech director, ask everybody around them. It's stage managers are managers, and they have their own kind of kingdom, the world of rehearsal, but they're also a part of the team. They're not only collaborating with the choreographer and dancers, they really need to take advantage of the people around them. And when you have questions, ask for help. Most of the things that we learn as performing artists and technicians is done through experience. So somebody else on the team may have had an experience with how to deal with something that you may not have had. And so it's enormously helpful to ask everybody. There's a lot of problem solving that goes on. when you use the team. So going on, the same choreographer wanted a live chicken on stage. The original concept was that the chicken on cue would fly from a perch where it was expected to sit through most of a performance and land on a table next to an egg, sit there through a piece of choreographer being performed over and around the chicken and egg, then fly back to the perch on cue and sit there for the rest of performance.
Brilliant.
My initial reaction was, you want a chicken to do what? Chickens are the dumbest bird outside of domestic turkeys. You can't expect to train a chicken in 4 weeks, not to mention the chickens can't fly. This merely led to the elimination of training the chicken, but the chicken was still wanted on stage. So just who is taking care of this chicken, I foolishly asked. The choreographer said that he would. Chicken eventually shows up at rehearsal space, et cetera, and that becomes the responsibility of the stage manager.
That's wonderful.
So because of the way school systems are set up, people who are trained in technical theater are almost all the time trained through a theater program, and choreographers are not trained through a theater program, so they don't often know the difficulties of doing things. So yeah, you have to keep them informed. Yes, Lisa? You want what?
When I was, I guess I was in high school, I was in a production of Oklahoma. And my family had a pony at the time who knew how to pull a cart. And so somewhere in there, they got a hold of my mother, and she agreed to let our pony be the pony that pulls the surrey with the fringe on top. And they actually took the cart and they painted it brown, and they put yellow fringe around the edge. You know, they tried to make it as look as much like it as possible. They built something behind the theater for the pony to stay at during the time of the show or whatever. And actually, I think they took care of feeding her and stuff. You know, I mean, we would show up every day too. They built a ramp so that she could go up the backstage steps. And then in the dark, we had to put her harness on and walk her behind the stage and to where her cart was. And at the very end of the show, there's like all this racket. They take pots and pans. There was a full orchestra. And she actually, all she had to do was to go on to stage. We drove her on stage. We picked up Curly and Sue, and there's singing, there's dancing, the orchestra, and then we leave. And she didn't poop once on stage, I will say.
And so she actually did the whole thing?
Oh yeah. A full run of The Sound of Music.
Wow. So yeah, generally when people ask for animals, they have to come from professional animal training facilities. Okay, so the stage manager goes on in regards to space. In some cases, space is really the final frontier. Since independent choreographers and companies don't always have their own space, rehearsal space and the search for it becomes a major priority. Since cheap space is hard to come by, you take it wherever you can find it, usually in the worst section of town. But it adds to the artistic ambiance, thank you. That's what somebody said in quote. But I prefer not to have to step over bodies when I leave rehearsal at 11 p.m. Yeah, that's become a big deal for performers in San Francisco. People on Broadway tours come from New York, and then they perform at the Golden Gate Theater. It's pretty shocking to them. Location aside, you have to consider the floor when looking at a space for dance. So we talked about floors. You know what needs to be done. Yeah. And there's a note here which I don't really understand that says, and pray that the choreographer doesn't change their mind about which side they want showing. Does that mean anything?
Side they want shown?
I was thinking of like a
I would think
photographer. Yeah, I'm not sure what she means anyway. My kit contains a large jar of liniment called mineral ice. The jar I have comes from a tack store and is acceptable for use on racehorses. It works better than the version you can get at the drugstore. So I'm not going to go into all of this, but you learn all sorts of substitutes as a stage manager that are actually better than the item that's been manufactured for the job. Like we talked about ice, the cold packs are hardly a substitute for ice, or even better, as this person says, bags of frozen peas or corns. She also keeps a record of shoe repair shops that specialize in dance shoes. People who can properly install taps. File cards of physiotherapists who take emergency walk-ins. I'm going to recommend.
I have a question,
Uh-huh.
because I have not had a whole lot of experience with a stage manager being present from the beginning of a dance rehearsal till the show. And I, in some ways, would think it'd be more advantageous for the stage manager to show up closer to the end before tech rehearsal, but not while all the kinks are being worked out. But I don't know if people have had other experiences and where it is super great to have the stage manager for every single rehearsal.
Yeah, this is kind of an ideal situation because stage managers don't generally, but I'm interested to hear why you think it would be better for them to show up later than sooner.
Well, just when the person was writing how the choreographer changes their mind and the beginning is now the end and the end is the beginning and there's a new middle section, and that's how I've always experienced learning choreography. That's, to a dancer or choreographer, I think that's part of the process. So, and I could imagine for a stage manager trying to notate all that, maybe it's just more of a headache than it needs to be because they could just wait till it's closer to the finished product.
Yeah, I think from that standpoint it can be, but I think if the choreographer understands what the stage manager is capable of in terms of keeping rehearsals flowing and schedules and being on top of people, that would be enormously relieving for them.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's having a stage manager, as starting from the beginning of rehearsal, we're talking about companies with at least $1 million budgets.
Okay.
Excuse me. This is something I also learned as a stage manager, or as anybody who works in the theater, don't own a truck because they'll ask you to haul everything around. I drive a Prius and I still have, you wouldn't believe what I've stuffed in there. Okay, so we still haven't finished this, but we'll continue next week, but I'm not next week, on Wednesday. I want to go over rehearsal reports in detail and then talking about keeping the cast on time. And then we will continue with the next class, the next topic, which I believe is about running meetings and setting agendas. But let me end with choreographer light bulb jokes. How many choreographers does it take to change a light bulb? Just one but they keep changing and changing. How many choreographers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Just one, but can you get it to turn the other way? How many choreographers does it take to screw in a light bulb? None. Where's my stage manager? She should have known that it was going to burn out today and changed it yesterday. That's true. There are some choreographers like that. So, all right. Thank you, guys. Oh, I just said it again. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank we.
Bye.